Today we will be changing things up a bit and looking at a figure from a series that we've not visited at all before. I do love my mechs and I love my Japanese culture, so why not combine the two together? This is RB-09 Akiru from the Robot Build series. To be honest, I don't know too much about this company or this brand. I've seen a few other figures from the line and they're all really cool, but this was one of the first ones that caught my eye. I've had him for quite a while and I've wanted to open him for quite a while as well. I've heard through some other folks online that he is from what was a spin-off sort of third-party transformer company. I'm not quite sure on how true that is, but either way, it is distributed by Wave Corporation, and I did like that Natori-sana figure that Wave Corporation also put out, so hopefully the same quality can be expected with this. Though of course, it is being manufactured by different people. I really like this mysterious robotic samurai look. This really feels like it's potentially inspired by Metal Gear or even Zone of the Enders as well. There's a black variant of this figure as well, but I felt that the black, white, and clear aesthetic was way cooler looking. So without further ado, let's figure out if this robot build is a series that I will want to get further into and open up RB-09 Akiru. So then, Akiru here comes in two separate blisters, the main one holding him, his katana, and his little tendril on his head, and then in a separate blister, a couple different hands as well as some knives. And here we have Akiru himself, and to be honest, I wasn't expecting him to be this large. Despite being able to see him through the package, this is still kind of astounding to hold him in hand. He's actually about 7 inches tall from foot to the top of his head, so that's pretty impressive. As you can see here by some scale, the Rintaro Okabe Figma is a tiny little man compared to the Captain Ginyu, which already is a huge SH Figuarts, and it's pretty much shoulder to shoulder with him. Meanwhile, Hiei over on a base as a pop-up parade just barely squeezes above him, and he does have some heightened elevation thanks to his scale. And before we continue, I should mention that this figure was roughly $60, and he's still available. If you want to go get him from HobbyLink Japan, follow my link in the description below, and I'll actually get a small kickback of that. And before I continue on to articulation, I should say that this figure is pretty unique in the fact that many of his parts do detach. I saw a video where they pretty much completely disassemble him because all of his parts are very simply plugged in with pegs, and they all come apart without too much effort, but not so little that it would fall apart. It seems that there is a level of customization put into this where you can mix and match parts from other figures, so that's a pretty fun little aspect of all this. And while he's in hand, I have to say this figure looks spectacular in person. There's something so different about these clear plastics here. Meanwhile, we have these very clear white markings that are just labeled on there, and I suppose they're probably printed, but either way, it all looks amazing. These gold highlights on the black, and all of the see-through parts just really do shine when you turn this thing around, and they even allow more of the brighter orange accents to really pop. Something as simple as the leg is incredibly mechanical and intricate, which I just think is such a nice, interesting change of pace for mechs. It could get a bit messy, sure, but I think this is done very tastefully. Whoa, I didn't know that he could do that. So articulation, let's take a look. He has a ball joint right there at his neck if you can't see, and it goes up and down and it swivels around, but it's not very agile with this hat, but that hat can be removed. Now without the hat, he still looks pretty cool, and there is further accessory here, but we'll get to that in a moment. His head can move around pretty decently, though it is obstructed just a bit by how chunky the sides are, though I don't think it's that big of a problem for a figure styled like this. Though I will say my camera is having a lot better time focusing on him without that hat. His pauldrons are connected by a ball joint at the shoulder, which swivels pretty well and moves around the way that you would expect it to. But there's also a peg joint right here as well. That can be turned so that these things can rotate and spin around and do all kinds of stuff, which I don't know how much that will help here, though since you can take parts of this figure and combine them into others, I think that it would be really nice there. Now, while his arm does have a peg going into the shoulder, it's also a ball joint right here, as well as a ball joint where it connects, which is kind of hard to show you, but you can see here it does have mobility there as well, though you do have to move it a bit to begin with just to loosen up that joint some. Now there's a segment back here where I guess you could call this his spine, and this does connect in a way that allows his waist to move side to side, which is really strange, but again, helpful if you want to combine and make something new with his parts. Then down here by the pelvis, I guess you could call it, he has pretty limited mobility. He can move side to side, but that's about it there. Not a ton, and it's actually coming from this little piece right here where his legs are connected. And his legs can move up and down, and of course roll around on a ball joint, but it's also attached with a peg. So again, we get quite a bit of mobility there. The knee is a hinge, but also it is a peg, which I guess would allow you to swivel it side to side, though beyond that, there's not much else you can do. Still, it does what it needs to, I think. He also has a lot of these little caps and flaps that can move around. These little guys here specifically are on small ball joints, which, I don't know, I guess that's fun. There's just a lot of weird mobility here that I guess I don't expect from a figure. And, oh, I just found another segment. There's a piece right by my middle finger, which is actually another pivot point that allows for some slight turning. Again, this would be something helpful if you wanted to combine these parts to something else. Now, each one of these shoulders is individually movable because they're attached in the middle by those pegs. So that's just even more mobility up top. This thing is kind of ridiculous. Finally, his foot seems to be on a ball joint as well, which of course is a peg, so that gets plenty of movement as needed. Overall, I'd say his mobility in general is pretty ridiculous. I did not expect all of that movement from a figure this clunky looking. Still, I don't know how practical that is, so in theory it's great, but I guess we'll just have to see if he's really workable. I'm constantly learning more about this figure. You can remove his forearm here, and I'll show you that his wrists are actually ball joints, and each hand individually has a ball joint, so it rotates and moves exactly as you would expect, though this does seem a bit loose. It kind of falls off rather easily, so be careful there. So as one might imagine, he comes with some swappable hands. This can be done in a weird way, because rather than just pop off the hand where the ball peg is, you would actually remove the entire wrist. These all attach via a peg joint, and each one is its own hand. But there's something strange about these hands. First, I'll show you that he comes with these opened, flat karate chop hands, and I guess you could fit something in if you really tried, but that's not what they're meant for. He came with a pair of fists on as standard, and each hand actually has a complete match for the opposite side, which is nice because sometimes they'll give you a gripping hand for one side but not the other. But on to those gripping hands. His gripping hands are holding a gray pole, which has pegs at each side. Now, this is for something very specific. He has this angled one here, as well as a straight up one as well, so you could hold the weapon at either angle. Though, what's really weird about this is that the actual gray piece is attached to the ball itself. So, there's no way to use this hand in any other way other than making him hold this. Though I will say that removing this was not intended because that was evidently glued there, and it fell off incredibly easily. I don't like this. This is really weird, though his hands are sort of flexible, so I guess maybe the plastic wouldn't have held weapons that well. Regardless, let's talk about those weapons. Like any good samurai, he comes with 2 katana, of which it actually says right here on the sheath, which is hilarious. Personally, I think these look awesome. The sheaths themselves are really cool. What's especially cool is that both of them can come out of those sheaths, and the actual blades look awesome. They're this smoky clear plastic, and they just look really authentic at different angles with different light coming off of them, and they're pretty sharp too, so they actually look like swords. I should also say that both of these sheaths do have the ability to move around on some peg joints, and then this peg can actually be attached into multiple areas on his body, though I would recommend the leg personally. He comes with a long sword as well as a short sword, which is pretty standard for a good samurai. And what's really interesting about these swords is how they actually attach. Rather than putting this entire thing in his hand, you actually take it apart. Because if you notice here, once either side is removed, it becomes that gray thing that he's holding in his alternate hands. This means instead of giving him a whole sword to hold, you just attach these pieces to that piece that's attached to his wrist joint. And now he can hold this. This is good for the fact that over time it won't scratch the hand putting it in and out. And if these are the only things he's meant to hold, I guess that's cool. But personally, I think it's just a little restrictive. So let's pop off his wrist joint and put this on. And now he's ready to fight. He also has one other thing that can be used, I suppose, as a defensive option. He also had a whole bag of these tiny little daggers. And they're not just daggers because they're actually meant to plug into the bottom of his hat. This is pretty interesting because now these all have different ball joints to rotate them around. And while you could try to put this on his head, I personally just wouldn't recommend it because it is a bit caught up in all of the chunkiness of his design. Though allow me to show you what its true purpose seems to be. Thanks to the peg joint in there, this can be plugged into his wrist. And now he can actually use it as a sort of a shield because it attaches right into his wrist, and then it can be moved pretty freely. I don't know how I feel about this. I think it would be better if he could just hold it with a hand, but I guess it's not coming loose anytime soon thanks to this, though it does have very limited articulation thanks to the fact that it's plugging straight into his forearm. Still, I'd say it looks pretty cool, but he's looking a bit bald, which is why they include this little ribbon that you are meant to plug atop his head. As you can see, there's a small peg right there, and this thing is pretty solid. It doesn't really flex very much, which I'm not very happy to see. They could have very well made this out of a flexible plastic, and it would have probably worked a lot better. So right where his hat went, you can just plug this thing in. And now he's got a bit of hair, I guess, or just a weird ribbon cable coming off of the top of his dome. All in all, he looks really cool, though I will say that with this shield, he looks more like a knight than he does a samurai. Still, I think this is a dope figure. His final accessory is this weird little runner, I guess. It looks like a runner for a plastic model kit, though I don't think this is meant to be punched out because it wouldn't be applicable anywhere. At the top, it says kakuseizu. I don't know what that's supposed to mean, and I guess you could put a keychain through this hole here and make it into a keychain, but ultimately this is kind of a mystery to me, though this is the brand, I guess, in their logo. So let's get into my final thoughts. So then, what do I think of RB-09 Akiru? I went into this originally thinking that maybe he was a bit clunky, and that maybe he just wasn't going to be what I expected. But as I continued to pose him for these final shots, I really learned to love this figure. This is one of those figures that you really do have to learn how to pose and use and play around with, because there is so much here that's movable and removable. Just as easily as you could disassemble and reconfigure Akiru, you could also combine him with other figures from the Robot Build series. I didn't want to get too crazy with this because I didn't know if I'd be able to put him back together correctly, but still, the ability to do all of that is incredibly innovative. And that's one thing I really love about this figure. Innovation. Not only in the design of the character being super badass looking, but the way that it's used and played with is incredibly different than some of the other stuff that I have. One thing I'll say is that there was some splintering in the wrists where the ball joints connect, but since he has so many, I can't really be that mad, though that does seem to be a design flaw that hopefully they'll work out. Beyond that, there are a few poses that are hard to get him into. His arms aren't entirely cooperative in getting him into certain positions, but for the most part, I had no trouble getting him into all these poses, as well as just making him stand still. He's incredibly sturdy. I didn't really do his articulation justice, because as I was playing with it, I learned so much more in how I could manipulate the figure. There's so many weird little things that can pivot and move, and there's double ball joints where I didn't expect them. It's just really, really well done. With all that said, I'm going to have to give Akiru a solid 8 out of 10. He may be RB-09, but he's going to get an 8 here, mainly for the fact that he does have those little issues. This figure isn't perfect, but I really do like it, especially as a first foray into this brand of robot build. I'm certainly more likely to buy more of them, though the price tag is a bit high, originally retailing at $60 or $70. Still, he is available right now. If you want to get him on HLJ, you could use my link and get him, and I get a small commission of that. Did you like this figure? Let me know in the comments below with a comment and tell me what you thought about it, or like the video if you enjoyed this review. I'm going to link something on screen for you guys to check out, so make sure to click that even if you have seen it, because it does help the channel. With all that said, thank you so much for watching, have an amazing day, and keep on collecting.